All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Myles, today we're going to be getting the Cosmos perspective. We're going to be talking to Aidan of Stride and Felix Lutch. Felix, we will refer to him throughout this episode, is sort of the godfather of liquid staking, as the author of the original delegation vouchers paper that you and I have referred to several times throughout this season from 2019. So this will be a really fun one.
I'm excited. Yeah, we get kind of a history lesson of really the origins of liquid staking from Felix, who's had a great perspective because Course One's been very active in both Cosmos and Lido on the Ethereum side. And then Aidan, who is really building on the cutting edge of liquid staking protocols today, and can kind of provide a preview of what other liquid staking protocols might be thinking about in a few months or years down the road when some of these ideas inevitably, translate over to other ecosystems.
And guys, when you're listening to this, what I want you to listen for, and we'll talk about it in the recap a little bit, is this tension in between flattening out the governance of liquid staking protocols and allowing users to decide, when the risk there is that maybe you get sort of an adverse outcome in terms of what your validator set ends up looking like, or liquid staking protocols actually being a permanent stakeholder and having an opinion, which could lead to decentralization of the validator set. So I want you to listen for that tension. We're going to talk about it during the actual podcast and then the recap. And I also want you to listen for the parts about fungibility of the protocol. That comes in right at the end, but that I think is an extremely important part of the episode as well.
Pumped to get into it.
Hey everyone, we've got a great episode here, but before we do, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Permissionless. This is the biggest and best conference in all of DeFi. It's the one that we do with Bankless, who's a great partner for us. Last year, we had almost 7,000 people there in West Palm Beach. We are moving this year to Austin, Texas, from September 11th through the 13th. And if you are a listener of Bell Curve, any of these last 5 seasons, this conference is basically custom made for you. We're going to be talking about liquid staking, the theme of this season. We've got a bunch of great panels on MEV. If you listen to the app chain thesis, we've got a bunch of Cosmos folks out there in full force. We're talking about the converging architecture of Solana, the roll-up space in ETH, and Cosmos. So I would love to see all of you there. And to reward you for being such great listeners to Bell Curve, you get a special 30% off code. It's BellCurve30. That'll get you 30% off tickets. Click the link in the show notes and then head over to the Permissionless site and make sure that you get your ticket today. Again, that is BellCurve30. Click the link in the show notes. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today, Myles and I are joined by Felix Lutch and Aidan Salzman. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
This is going to be an exciting episode where we're going to dive into some of the big questions that we've been asking about liquid staking from the perspective of what's going on in the Cosmos ecosystem. And as per usual, as Myles and I note in this show, oftentimes some of the big questions that are being asked in Ethereum, the Cosmos ecosystems tends to be 6 to 12 months ahead. So hopefully we're actually going to get some answers and some early attempts at experimentation for solving some of the big things that we've been talking about this season. But before we get into that, we've referenced several times this season that the first person to post something publicly about liquid staking was, in fact, Felix Lutch. So I don't want to call you the Godfather, Felix, of liquid staking, but one might describe that title to you. So can you kind of take us back to that blog post that you wrote and what you were thinking when you sort of outlined delegation vouchers and kind of the history of liquid staking, and then any surprises in terms of how it's evolved up to this point?
Right. Yeah, totally. And yeah, again, thanks for having me on. Really been a long time coming. So this post, I think, is at some point in 2019, right? Or so we've been quite kind of circling around liquid staking since like 4 years now, and it really, I think, got like a lot of traction this year. Obviously, with Lido already last 2 years, but I think now with you guys like covering it, there's a lot more eyes on it, and a lot of people like interested, a lot more protocols being built around liquid staking. At that time, when we wrote the post, it was more that proof of stake was basically just emerging, and there was the sort of delegation model in Cosmos. So you had this concept of, okay, you have the validators, and then you have the token holders that like sort of just delegate their votes to validators. And this sort of principle existed in Cosmos already, but also in other networks like Tezos, and given we were like one of the first staking providers, we were kind of looking at, what's like the similarities between these models, or how can it be evolved. And at the same time, while we were writing this, actually, there was basically the DeFi summer in Ethereum starting to go on. And being in Berlin, I was in full node with Brian, CEO, of course, and we were like kind of observing some of the initial DeFi protocols and their designs. So like one notable one is like Compound, which has this idea of the C tokens, where essentially you deposit your tokens and you receive this C token in return that kind of represents your position in the Compound protocol. And we realized, this is very similar to what you could do in proof of stake with the validator delegations, essentially. And we foresaw that there would be like a sort of merging between DeFi and liquid staking at some point, since sort of like, I guess what we were always thinking is that staking is kind of the base layer of these networks and is kind of like a financial activity. And then people will want to like hedge their risk or manage their risk in various ways. And to do that, you will require like some sort of more flexibility than what the core protocols often offer. And as like sort of through that brainstorming, we were part of this hackathon in Hack Adam, actually in Berlin, like a very cool, one of the earliest Cosmos hackathons, and worked together with Sunny and Dev from back then Sika, now Osmosis, obviously, on this concept of delegation voucher. So basically just taking it one step further from just having the delegation structure in the code, but actually turning it into like a token that when you delegate, you receive like a validator specific liquid staking token, let's say. And that you could then always like convert back according to this mechanism that's here on the screen right now for those that watch the YouTube video. And that's really where it started. And then I sort of realized, oh wow, there's like such a big design space there in this world. And we saw like slowly like projects emerge, like some of them including like the Stake DAO, Julian's idea for Tezos. There was also Stader and some other projects that are all covered in the liquid staking report that I later wrote. So I was kind of realizing, we need, like, this is a big topic. We should be making like a working group to kind of talk about this and figure out what the right way is to like implement liquid staking, or where it's going and what the risks are. And that ultimately turned into liquid staking report that is then later, I think probably like a year later, I released. And so there I go into like sort of the benefits of liquid staking, but why it's needed, sort of like the comparison to staking with centralized exchanges and the powers of centralized exchanges, and why liquid staking is sort of a potentially force for decentralization, but also the risks in terms of like what happens when you sort of over financialize maybe these staking positions, and sort of what are the problems that can emerge there. I'm sure we'll go into a lot of these in the episode.
Yeah. And I wanna bookmark and return to this idea of liquid staking as a force for decentralization. Like, we're going to spend some time later in the episode talking about that. But can you just kind of walk us through, Felix, at the time, what was the response initially to this idea? Because now we've all sort of taken it as this given. Liquid staking is one of the few things, especially over in Ethereum, that is really working and chugging along, sort of despite market conditions. But I imagine there was some pushback, and we've had Dave on the program before, and Dave has some very particular thoughts about liquid staking, I would say. So what was some of the initial feedback? And then one question, Myles and I we're looking at this initial diagram that you drew between the user, the validator pool, and the validator. And actually, we noticed that there was a conversion ratio of 2 atoms per 1 voucher. So we're wondering if initially the idea for liquid staking was that you would, for instance, in the stETH metaphor, you deposit 2 ETH, you get 1 stETH back. And if you had actually thought that through. Just a small question there. We've been wondering.
Yeah. So why this number is more just like illustrative, but like it was clear that sort of because you earn the rewards, we sort of were thinking in delegations vouchers of this model that's not rebasing. So basically, like the conversion ratio of 1 liquid delegation voucher would increase, like in terms of the pure atom. So that's what this kind of represents. Like in case of, like, let's say this delegation voucher system was running for a while, then it might be that at some point, 1 voucher represents like 2 atom. So this was just for illustrative purposes there. And then I guess the pushback, right? I think at that time, specifically, most of the people in proof of stake I would say were like protocol developers or very like deep engineering people, folks in general. And so their thinking is like, I would say like pretty extremely long term around the health of the protocol and like sort of attack scenarios of 33% or 66% attacks, and then how they could come about or how an attacker might abuse the proof of stake system. So I think there is some pushback there that, liquid staking might introduce this sort of kind of too powerful thing that like all the stake aggregates in one specific liquid staking protocol, and that this then sort of has power over the protocol, which is certainly, I think, like probably the biggest pushback. And then, many would probably also just say, hey, it's not really needed. No one really needs this or something like this. But I think in terms of like what's dangerous, it's probably the main point. And I think the thing is that protocol, I think at that time, many were thinking, oh, we can sort of restrict this in the protocol and like sort of design the protocol in a way to make it very hard to do this potentially. But given we have like smart contract capabilities, we have centralized exchanges, we have so much infrastructure, and the market generally, I guess, is my opinion, and sort of is proven over time that like kind of strives for this capital efficiency, there will be ways that can kind of circumvent these restrictions, and those will be very successful. So I think, like my personal opinion, and I guess we might also get back to this, is that in the end, the protocol, if it's like successful enough, will have to deal with these issues and might be better off like sort of enshrining it, like as you say, or like putting it native into the protocol, these liquid staking kind of systems to avoid having captured by some external party too much. I'm sure that's like probably like one of the core topics we're going to talk about, so I'm really excited.
Yeah, and I think we can definitely get into a little bit of that later, especially with the liquid staking module coming, which is essentially a version of what you just described. But maybe just to stay back in the 2019, 2020 era, when you wrote this paper, Ethereum was still proof of work. I think, the beacon chain was on its way, but it was not yet live. And so I guess to ask directly, why do you think, this concept took off on Ethereum when it originated in Cosmos? And liquid staking is now alive and thriving in Cosmos, thanks to folks like Aidan here. But it has taken a while. So I would just love to, as somebody that was deeply involved in both the Cosmos side, as well as one of the early validators of Lido, I think you have a great perspective to kind of look back and do a retrospect here.
Yeah, what also almost like surprised me, I think we were like, I guess in Cosmos, many of the people in Cosmos are validators or like sort of have a deep understanding of proof of stake and like infrastructure, versus on the Ethereum where the actual like community was more DeFi, maybe, and NFTs and all these applications, sort of smart contract developers. And I think we were in a way, Cosmos was thinking early about these concepts because many of the folks were like on that layer. But then sort of the adoption from the applications is missing in Cosmos. And I think like liquid staking relies a lot on having that to be useful. And also that the difference being on Ethereum that you actually don't have a delegation model. So it's very hard to stake your ETH if you're just have ETH and you're like a normal person, you don't want to run the infrastructure. There's very few ways to actually engage. And like it's essentially Lido or like liquid staking brought this model to Ethereum in the first place. And then obviously also the other point being that given the merge hasn't happened, so like this kind of gradual rollout of staking, of proof of stake in Ethereum, meant that there's a long period where if you stake normally, like you couldn't actually get liquidity on your staked assets, and Lido was able to kind of provide some liquidity for people that might want to withdraw through the curve pool, and like incentivizing that heavily to like maintain the peg between STETH and ETH for the first year until the merge, and sort of that I think is a very big value proposition that just wasn't there in Cosmos, and maybe still is less there. Also like now in Ethereum it's less there, but I guess now Lido already has like such a market share. There's other other forces at play, I think, that keep it very interesting in Ethereum. Also, like, again, the just greater amount of liquidity and more DeFi activity going on that sort of pushes liquid staking a bit more.
Right. So it kind of sounds like the perfect storm where you have a combination of, higher barriers to entry to actually participate in validating. You have this, lack of liquidity even beyond a 21-day unbonding period. It was, at earliest a couple of years. And then, you actually have higher amounts of utility through, an early DeFi ecosystem where you could replicate some of the benefits of what you'd be able to do on a centralized exchange, whereas that in Cosmos just took a little bit longer to develop. Is that kind of a fair summary?
Yeah, I think maybe also to add, like, literally from the experience as a node operator trying to get started on Ethereum, we were lucky enough to be connected with a lot of folks early and sort of participating in that. But in the terms of offering a staking as a service for Ethereum outside of these protocols, it's actually quite a hard task. You need to build a lot of infrastructure, like API or some sort of product that allows people to stake even just 32 ETH with you, which is a very cumbersome activity. And it's basically like an entire team that needs to build something like this. And this is also something that why there aren't that many staking products on Ethereum, even from node operators, right? You need basically a team of 20 plus to be able to support such a product. And in Cosmos, it's very different, right? You just register your validator. You can be one dude in the basement, and you can receive delegation. So that's much more easy, lower barrier to entry, like you mentioned.
I think that totally makes sense. And maybe just shifting gears a little bit towards, I think we want to get your perspective on just the relationship between liquid staking protocols and professional validators, because I think it's very interesting that it seems like Lido was developed by P2P, and Course One was very early in getting involved there, and you've were very involved in the development of Quicksilver on the Cosmos side, and it seems like from the seat of a validator, you can look at liquid staking protocols as at the time probably an existential threat, but also one of the best distribution channels that you could imagine, right? It's just they take care of all the BD for you, and have plenty of ways to use these liquid staking tokens, and you can just kind of get into the set and receive deposits. But of course, that's a much lower share than if you were to receive 100% of those deposits, like you would in traditional staking. And so, I'll actually pose this to both of you guys, but how do you guys view the relationship between validators and LST protocols today, and what was it like back then when some of these were just getting started?
I'll start, and maybe Aidan can add his view from the other side. I think our perspective, I think what's interesting is, right, there is this sort of conflict, like you said, when you're on the node operator side, where you sort of understand deeply the staking mechanism, and I guess that led many to sort of get involved in liquid staking in some way, also developing protocols there. But then once they are there, you have this sort of conflict that, okay, now I have to basically spread my stake across these different providers, like in most of the cases, right? And that sort of makes it less attractive. You would rather have someone stake directly with you. I do think that, though, given this depends also on the size of the node operator. For many, I think liquid staking is actually, it's one of the best distribution methods, and also forces for decentralization, where before that you basically have the foundations which basically bootstrap the validators often. So there is a foundation of a certain protocol, they have maybe 10-20% of the tokens, and they would pick the node operators that provide value to the ecosystem and sort of distribute the stake across them. I think that was the first entity which many smaller operators that don't have big marketing budgets or BD rely on, that sort of existed. And then liquid staking protocols is sort of a extension of that, where now it's very focused on this specific staking use case. The foundation generally has a lot of other kind of things to do, and is also not profit oriented. So the liquid staking protocol is more I guess a product that has its users, or the yield and the safety of the protocol more in mind, and is actually, I think, doing often a better job than the foundation at sort of picking the best operators. And so from the perspective of the network, I think that's actually desirable. And then as a node operator, For many, it's actually a very, very nice way to get some stake, and I think many like desire to be in one of these sets. But then the very big ones, they have like sort of this problem that, oh, now I actually would rather have people stake directly with me. And there are a few ways where how this can be achieved. Like, for example, stake-wise, V3 is an interesting model that allows a little bit to the node operators to retain this ability by having these vaults that you basically stake directly with an operator, but you can still get a liquid staking asset by essentially collateralizing these validator specific positions. And that's, I think, an interesting model that works for large node operators and still kind of gives their clients the ability to still like opt into liquid staking if they would want to. So again, I think, in general, the liquid staking design space is quite large, and overall, I would say, very interesting for validators. But
I think it's a really interesting question. Maybe one of the most interesting between on the relationship between liquid staking protocols and validators. So when I think about liquid staking, my assumption is I'm obviously very biased as a founder of a liquid staking protocol, but my assumption is that liquid staking will go to like 80 to 100%. So I think Felix and Myles, you both brought up some really good points around why it took longer for liquid staking to take off in Cosmos. So there's this cold start problem with DeFi. ETH was very liquid; you could use it. So DeFi was bootstrapped, and then ETH demand was there because DeFi existed. Like you said, it's also easier to stake in Cosmos. So it's if you're a bit more crypto native, maybe you just go and delegate your stake to a validator. Whereas on Ethereum, it's pretty challenging to run a node. And there are also some technical reasons why it took a bit longer on Cosmos. So the Cosmos hub didn't have smart contracts. But there were actually places in Cosmos that liquid staking did take off. So in the Terra ecosystem, which was a Cosmos SDK chain, I think bLuna launched, it was a Lido LST, and it launched sometime in 2020 or 2021. But my assumption is that in spite of all of these challenges in Cosmos, having liquidity and yield is such an attractive value proposition for end users that liquid staking probably will go to 80 to 100%. So therefore, it is a pretty important question for validators. But when I think about how validators and liquid staking protocols interact, liquid staking protocols, I think, are just larger entities that validators can attract stake from. So they can go and attract stake from little fish like you or I, or they could go after a big whale, or they could go after a liquid staking protocol. And there are different strategies for validators to attract stake from each of these entities. So although liquid staking protocols might take a cut of the yield, they can also, in some cases, attract so much more stake from a liquid staking protocol that I think it outweighs that. But for large validators in particular, I think it's a bit of an interesting question because in delegated proof of stake, especially, stake is skewed to the top of the set. So I think in a previous podcast, you and Hasu were discussing this, where validators can only really differentiate on a couple of dimensions, the main ones being brand and yield. So being at the top of the set is a really strong indicator that the validator is good. And most users don't go and stake to the bottom of the set. I mean, we see this empirically, like 90% of stake is with distributed across the top 10 validators in most delegated proof of stake chains. So in that sense, liquid staking protocols might take some stake away from the top validators and redistribute it across the set. But if liquid staking protocols are well designed, then I think they can be distribution channels for good validators. So it might be a little bit of a reframing from like taking away stake from the largest validators to distributing stake across validators that are really good. Because some validators at the top of the set are really good, but there are also really good validators at the bottom of the set. And then defining this question of what is good and rating validators on a scale is a real challenge. And I'm sure we'll get into this more later. But I would reframe it slightly as a redistribution to validators that the liquid staking protocol has defined as good. Maybe that's decentralization. Maybe it's geographical diversity. There's all kinds of attributes you can think about.
I actually do want to push into that a little bit right now, Aidan, actually, because I feel like this is a very important conversation that's happening again over in Ethereum land with Lido and the staking router. And that's what we're trying to move towards here, right? Which is a more decentralized validator set. That's what everyone sort of wants to see. So can we actually get into that idea of, how the presence of a liquid staking provider like a Stride might actually counteract some of those sort of natural market forces that concentrates stake in the very top sort of echelon of validators?
Yeah, so I start from the assumption that on most blockchain networks, 90% roughly of network power accrues to maybe the top 10 entities. And I think this is roughly true for most proof of stake and proof of work chains. If you look at Bitcoin, there's large mining pools. If you look at proof of stake chains, specifically delegated proof of stake chains, most stake is accrues to the top 10 entities. And maybe there's like a little bit of uncertainty here. Maybe a chain can really push on decentralization and they can get this stake distributed across 15 entities. Or maybe they care a little bit less and it's only distributed across 5. But for the most part, stake does follow this sort of power law distribution to the top of the set. And I think this is where liquid staking protocols can really help decentralize the network. So it is, I think it's a big reframing as LSPs as a decentralizing force. Typically, when we've talked about liquid staking protocols, we focus on all of the risks of liquid staking protocols, and there are some centralization risks. So for example, if a liquid staking protocol is hacked, that would be really bad for the network. This particular argument has never really resonated with me, given lots of things can be hacked in networks. For example, the core staking logic in a chain can also be hacked. But there are definitely some centralizing forces and risks. But if you look just empirically at how liquid staking protocols or good liquid staking protocols distribute their stake across sets, the distribution is typically more decentralized. And then there's a question of how you actually define decentralization. But the stake is more distributed across a broader set of validators that hopefully are differentiated on things like clients, geographical diversity, jurisdictions, all of these things. I think actually John Carbonneau had this presentation at Modular Summit where he was looking at Lido's stake distribution versus Ethereum's. And like any normal observer can look at this and tell which one is more distributed. So I think there's a lot of potential for liquid staking protocols to distribute stake much more broadly across sets.
I think that's really important because I think the assumption, or at least the narrative last year, and is starting to change, is all about the self-limiting debate, right? Like this is, okay, Lido's become too big at this point. But a lot of people there's two ways to look at Lido. You can look at it as one entity because governance, right, is just one entity and it controls a lot there. Or you could look at it as, a distribution of, what is it now, like 30-ish, right, entities that are actually, operating the underlying stake and are diversified geographically, different clients, right? And I think that does, pose like a pretty stark picture when you look at Lido compared to the rest of Ethereum. And on the Cosmos side, it's a little bit different because you actually have the ability, right, to delegate your stake to the validator that you want. Versus Ethereum, the assumption is that the next validator will be some, solo staker that has their own 32 ETH, and that every validator, every net new stake that enters the system will further decentralize the system, which we know is actually not true. But yeah, how do you view kind of like the difference between a delegated proof of stake network and what we have on Ethereum, and maybe the role of LSTs in comparing the role of LSTs on both systems? Because I think that they kind of address different problems, because with delegated proof of stake, you give the users your choice, but you know how that actually ends up looking. And it's very, very transparent how it looks, right? But on Ethereum, I think it's a little bit less transparent. It's a little bit more opaque how these same forces actually do translate and extend over to Ethereum. But yeah, I'll kind of pose that question to the group. Basically, how do we shift this narrative on both ecosystems?
What I found interesting, and I think is also on the modular summit actually, or like I think somewhere, was that some people are like arguing essentially also for the decentralized. So sequencing, right, is also like a topic now, right, where they think about, okay, we're going from a single sequencer to like decentralizing, which essentially is like, again, pretty much the same if you look at it at a high level than any proof of stake network. And then I guess proof of stake is sort of the easiest kind of solution that achieves some sort of distribution, because you're just saying, hey, let the market do its thing here. It's like a financial thing. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum, maybe like a system where the governance decides it. And now whatever governance means, I guess it can be that you just have a proof of authority chain where the project founders say, hey, you 5 people run it. Or it's like some token voting within that DAO of that project. Or the way it is in Lido, where all the existing operators have like one vote to like do new onboardings of operators, or potentially even, some algorithmic solution that tries to distribute the stake across operators. And I think, I guess from my side, all these different models should somehow exist, and I guess the users will decide what's best. I think it's also like kind of Vasily's core argument last year on ETHDC, where Lido had like a lot of backlash from the Ethereum community, sort of, oh, you're a danger to the ecosystem. But then it's like, hey, ETH holders decide what's best, and then I think I definitely subscribe to that too. So, let these solutions compete, and then sort of the best will win out. I think if you're like kind of forcing one solution on the system, there will probably emerge like some like sort of protocol that will try to kind of introduce differences, and I think that's actually healthy for the ecosystem at large. So for people that think, well, Lido, we need to like shut it down, I guess that would be my sort of framing, that, it just because if Lido goes away, it wouldn't be that like suddenly like 30% home stakers appear and stake their ETH, but it would probably be some other entity that potentially is worse, because like Lido is actually, everything's sort of open source and very contributing to ecosystem. So I think having these forces is very important.
I have a question, because this is something I've been curious about this entire season, which is, so the Vasily core argument of the ETH holder should just decide, right? We had Sriram on an early episode of this season, and he mentioned something very similar. The demand side of middleware operators that want to opt into that system, they should just decide. The issue, though, is that at the current stage of where we are at in crypto is, I think if you just blanket allowed users to decide, you'd end up with some pretty negative outcomes. So I think what we're saying on this podcast is that actually liquid staking tokens, part of the value prop that they can do is they can exert some sort of opinion on the validators, right? They're this really valuable distribution channel. The state of, per John Charbonneau's discussion at Modular Summit, the validator set that Lido, if you look at Lido's validator set versus ETH in general, it's actually sort of a source for good because it's more decentralized. But in that, you're implicitly admitting the sort of power that liquid staking token networks have, right? And I think that is really the core crux of the question. And it's, we're referencing John Charb here. He came out with another recent piece. We're recording this on Monday, August 7th. So this piece came out about an hour ago, so we haven't had the full time to digest it, but it's just very interesting. Again, I think it's very, like, a lot of the arguments that are happening specifically right now in roll-up land, I think the correct mental model actually is Cosmos chains, because they're going through a lot of this very similar sort of experimentation. And my question is, what happens? So maybe Aidan, I'll direct this to you as the operator of a liquid staking protocol. What happens if the decentralization that you would want to see in your validator set runs counter to market forces. And what I mean by that is, what if you actually have a market of users that want just the top 5 validators? And no matter how many times you try to cycle through this idea of decentralization or promoting other smaller validators, what your customers are telling you is, I really just want to be with the big guys here. I mean, how do you balance if market forces go against what we all want to see in terms of decentralization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I have an answer to it, but I'll give some thoughts. So I think the first thing I'll say is I think that is mostly correct. I think end stakers actually don't really care about which validator they're delegating to, except for these two things. They want brand, which I think you can just swap out for safety, and then they want yield. So really, they just want like the best risk-adjusted return across validators that they can get. And the simple way to do this is to assume that the top 10 validators are the safest, and then just like sort them based on one or two things, such as yield. But I think it might actually not be totally correct that the top 5 or 10 validators really are the safest, or the least prone to slashing, things like that. So I think one way that you can sort of combat this is by introducing a new layer of abstraction between users and validators. And there's different ways that you could approach this. So one simple way that this is done today is through liquid staking. When you mint a liquid staking token, when you deposit an Atom or an Ethereum or an ETH into a liquid staking protocol, you just get an ST Atom or an ST ETH back. And there are some liquid staking protocols where you do choose a validator at delegation, but for the most part, you don't. There are other ways where, so I think Osmosis has been working on a protocol where you can have validator set preferences. So rather than saying like, I want this validator, you can express a preference that says, I want a validator that is geographically distributed, or I want my stake to be distributed across validators that have never been slashed. So there are preferences that you can express.
So I want to get into the liquid staking module here, but one idea, another question that Myles and I have been sort of recurrently asking throughout this season is, are there parts of the protocol that you might be able to, if this is a winner take all market or a winner take most market, which Myles and I have sort of been asking and assuming that that's correct, are there parts of the protocol that you could actually ossify? So the way this gets talked about sort of over in ETH land is dual governance, right? And allowing stETH holders actually some amount of say over core decisions, or the ability to veto, essentially. But something else I found myself wondering, Aidan, and this seems very technically complex, so I don't know how you would actually do this, but is there a way that you could give some sort of guarantee that and ossify this directly into either the protocol or the liquid staking module, the design of it, that you actually say, we can, maybe this is a good time to get into the liquid staking module because there's a cap, from my understanding, on the amount of staked Atom that you can have. But maybe you could actually bake in some sort of distribution and set of logic or rules that, we will not allow the validator set to be, above X concentration, right? Is that something that you could actually design into these protocols so that you wouldn't have to necessarily trust Aidan, the operator of Stride, but I could trust the way that the product is constructed?
Yeah, I think it is something that you can bake in, although it gets close to something that I think you can't bake in or ossify. So the only, or the most challenging thing to ossify in liquid staking protocols is, in my opinion, the validator selection mechanism. Basically, everything else can be fully ossified, but validator selection is, there's a very human element to validator selection. One trivial way to think about it is, as validator sets change over time, someone has to tell the liquid staking protocol how the validator set has changed. So let's say, today we say like validator A is in Europe, validator B is in the US. And then we have some notion of how to distribute stake across these two entities. In a few years, if validators A and B are long gone and now we have validators C and D, there has to be some human in the loop that is telling the liquid staking protocol what the attributes of these validators are. So then I think you can sort of break it up into a delegation strategy. So thinking about how a liquid staking protocol distributes stake across validators with different attributes. And then there's a second question, which is how do you assign these attributes to different validators? And I think they're challenging in different ways. The second question hasn't really been broached yet. I think for the most part, liquid staking protocols assume that validator operators are honest in some ways. Like if they say they're in a certain geography, maybe they run some checks, but you kind of trust them that they're doing what they say. But I do think this will become more challenging through time. And then the first part of this, which is can a liquid staking protocol just ossify the delegation strategy? I think it could, but I don't know if it would be a great idea. Yeah, I mean, one reason is like the world changes through time. So like for that simple reason, you'd probably want your liquid staking protocol to be flexible enough to update delegation strategies based on real things that are happening in the world. And there's a spectrum of ways that you could update this. It could be on the very conservative end, it could be super infrequent, or on the more aggressive end, maybe it's more frequent. But even so I don't think it's possible to fully ossify validator selection, although pretty much everything else you probably can.
I think I agree with that. I would say maybe just to push back, the only, I guess, path to ossifying that is that I see would be just to give that ability to the user and then find a way to, wrap these non-fungible positions into a larger pool and then don't touch it. And I think that this gets into really, part of what the liquid staking module is trying to do. And it's probably a good time to shift there. So I know, Felix, you alluded to it earlier, but there's always been this question of, can we bake some sort of way to mint liquid staking tokens into the chain itself in a way that the chain is aware that they are being minted and aware of or maybe opinionated about how users can delegate that stake. And the liquid staking module is getting at this. And I think, just to give kind of a preview of why we think it's important, we've been talking a lot about, this ability on Ethereum and with Lido, if this could ever be, an option for stakers to delegate to a staking module of their choice. That is more or less, a version of this is being implemented right now in Cosmos. And so, Aidan, I know you've been very involved in the development of the liquid staking module. And I would just love if you could kind of walk us through what it is, what the flow looks like for a user, and then where Stride comes in, I guess, after the initial minting of this position.
And I'm actually going to ask you to go for folks who might be listening, Aidan, that aren't exactly sure what these modules are sort of in Cosmos land. Could you even just describe what a module is relative to Cosmos? Sure. And then we get into the liquid staking one.
Definitely. So starting with this idea of a module, in many general purpose smart contract chains, the base layer is abstracted from most end application developers. So you have this clear delineation of infrastructure code and application code. For example, Ethereum, Solana, any other smart contract platform, there's one set of developers that works on infrastructure. And then typically there's a mostly disjoint set of developers that builds applications on top of that. And in Cosmos, the lines are much more blurry. So because there's this design philosophy of creating application-specific blockchains where the infrastructure and the application are interwoven to make the application better. The technical architecture of these chains is a little bit different. So the idea of a module is just, it's one specific piece of either infrastructure or application code that that lives on the chain. So you might have a module for staking. So when you stake to a validator, some logic needs to happen under the hood. And in fact, there is a Cosmos module which just handles staking. There's another module which handles slashing. So if validators misbehave, this code will deal with slashing validators and stakers. Osmosis has a module that deals with swaps. So it has all of the AMM logic embedded within that module. So a module is just like one piece of infrastructure and application code that is bundled and lives at the actual protocol layer. So it's not built on top of the protocol as a smart contract. It's actually baked into the protocol itself. And it lets developers have a little bit more flexibility in how they build things and sort of a nice abstraction.
That's really helpful explanation there. So that's just sort of helpful context now for setting up specifically the liquid staking modules. Then sort of just Myles' question there. Could you just describe what that is? And then maybe we get into the user flow of like where the liquid staking module ends and where Stride begins sort of.
So the liquid staking module is one of these infrastructure application modules. And the idea is that the liquid staking module will be built into the Cosmos hub itself. You could build it into any Cosmos blockchain, but the Cosmos hub will probably be the first. So I think we've talked a lot about why LSTs matter in Cosmos. Maybe one thing that we haven't touched on yet, Cosmos has very low liquidity, but there is lots of stake. And stake rates are also typically or staking yield is typically much higher on Cosmos. So DeFi is extra challenging. Not only is there the cold start problem, but no one wants to use a token that has like a 20 or 30% yield as collateral. So for this reason, I think LSTs can kickstart DeFi in Cosmos. But as Felix pointed out, there are lots of risks with LSTs, and especially for Cosmos, which I think is one of the first ecosystems to really engage with proof of stake and specifically BFT systems on a really deep level. I think there's a lot of skepticism around liquid staking tokens because it's taking something that is really core to the ecosystem overall. So LSM, or the liquid staking module, attempts to solve two problems. And it starts from a couple of assumptions. So the first is that the risks associated with liquid staking aren't very well understood. There are some logical arguments why liquid staking is good or bad, but it's been pretty hard to quantify some of these risks. I think Felix did a lot of work on this in the initial report, but I haven't seen really in-depth, rigorous analysis on this since then, and it's been years. I think this is starting back up again. For example, with this podcast, lots of people are talking about liquid staking and trying to quantify these risks. But today, the fact of the matter is, it's just not very well understood. And the second thing that is a bit unique about the structure of Cosmos is once there's a lot of native stake, liquid staking is hard because stakers have to unbond. So it's going to take to onboard lots of liquid stake. Everyone's going to have to unbond their tokens and forgo weeks of yield. And this is a really painful process. So given these two assumptions, these are sort of the foundational assumptions that led to LSM. So maybe diving into how to best think about LSM. I think LSM is best understood as a form of regulation on liquid staking providers. It creates a safety framework, and there are lots of governance control parameters to modulate the safety framework through time. But it creates a safety framework to help regulate the adoption of liquid staking. So this sort of addresses the first problem of the risks of liquid staking are just not well understood. LSM, or liquid staking module, creates a framework to regulate liquid staking providers. And then second, it lets stakers liquid stake instantly. And this might sound a bit sort of counterintuitive. Like, why would Stride be supporting something that sounds like it's in direct competition with the protocol. But the way that the liquid staking module lets users liquid stake is it gives them a liquid staking token that is an NFT that is specific to the validator that they delegated to. So it does let users unbond their stake instantly, but in return, they get this NFT that is not composable or really useful in DeFi. So if you think about the liquid staking module, I would say it's closer to infrastructure than it is application code. It is built into the base layer of Cosmos, and it does technically let users or stakers liquid stake. But in return, because you get this NFT, there's not a whole lot that you can go do with it. If you take this NFT that you get, you can't go to a lending protocol or osmosis to use it as collateral or swap it because it's not fungible with other liquid staking tokens. So that's sort of a high level summary of why LSM was built and how I think about it, and a little bit of what it is under the hood.
Maybe actually what I'm wondering is are these NFTs per validator fungible, or like?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sort of. So the slashing risk is fungible. If you and I both hold a liquid staking token NFT for Chorus One and Chorus One is slashed, both of our tokens will be slashed. But they are NFTs, so they're not totally fungible. Like the yield for my tokens goes to my address, the yield for your tokens goes to your address. But right. I think this sort of illustrates the point that these things are really challenging to explain, and they were designed with liquid staking protocols as the end consumers in mind, rather than users like you and I.
That's super interesting. And maybe just before we jump to, I guess, where Stride comes in, I'm curious if you could just speak to some of these risk parameters that you mentioned that are, customizable through governance. I think going back to the self-limiting debate, it sounds like that could actually, something like that could be baked into the chain's logic itself, as well as, making sure that some validators are not getting all of the delegations, right, that are minted through this liquid staking module. And so would just love to hear kind of what is the regulation and the parameters around it that you're referring to here specifically?
Like I mentioned, there's really two components to the liquid staking module. The first is acceleration of liquid staking adoption. I think we'll talk about this later. This is where Stride and the liquid staking module sort of meet. And then the risk mitigation is the second part of the liquid staking module. And when the liquid staking module was first proposed, there were a bunch of different types of risk that were talked about. Like I said, none of these were perfectly quantified, but we, along with Occlusion, Zaki, the Osmosis team, lots of Cosmos ecosystem participants, were trying to think from first principles about what different types of risks liquid staking could introduce. And there were 3 or 4 main categories that we thought about. And the liquid staking module doesn't try to address all of them, but it does address some of them. So 2 of them are governance risk as well as vote power concentration risk. So governance risk is the idea that if a liquid staking provider gets more than, say, 1/3 of the total staked supply on a chain, that liquid staking protocol could actually halt the chain because Cosmos relies on 2/3 of validators signing blocks for liveness. So if you have more than 1/3 that stop signing blocks, then the chain just halts. And this is, of course, quite bad. So the way that this is mitigated is there's actually a limit on how much network stake can be liquid. Currently, I think the limit in the signaling proposal was something like 25%. And the thinking was if 25% of all stake is liquid, you would have to have 25% of total stake unbond in order for the liquid staking protocol to have 1/3 of the network. So you'd have to have basically like a huge unbonding. 25% of all stake would have to unbond for a liquid staking protocol to amass 1/3. because so there's sort of this safety buffer built in. I don't view this as like a long-term solution. Like I said, I think the incentives around liquid staking will drive it to maybe 80 or 100% adoption, but it is maybe a good check on liquid staking while we explore what the risks are and how exactly we can quantify them. So it's more of I think, a speed bump than a wall.
No, it makes sense. It's a number that both sides can agree upon, right? And it's beneficial for the liquid staking protocols because you get past this hump or this barrier, which is the unbonding period, and it's something that the other side that is maybe more wary of the risks of liquid staking can get behind because it kind of limits what this worst case scenario could look like, and that's super interesting. And so maybe but of course that could change over time, right? It's once people get comfortable with, the way that you guys handled the delegation of stake, see that it's healthy, maybe we can raise that cap beyond 20 and, maybe even just lift it completely.
So it's just a parameter. And because Cosmos chains have governance built in, someone could just put up a governance proposal to raise it. And then after the 2-week up period, it would be raised. The second, there's one other safety measure that's built in. So the second one, so the first one tries to address this governance risk of what if a liquid staking protocol is hacked or tries to attack the chain? How would that be handled? The second one addresses not liquid staking protocols overall. Rather, it addresses the individual validators that make up the liquid staking protocol. And specifically, it tries to address the principal agent problem. So the idea is that when there's one party, the agent, that takes actions on behalf of some owner, a principal, then sometimes these parties can get misaligned. And this sort of already exists in delegated proof of stake systems, but some people think it's maybe a little bit worse in liquid staking protocols. So the liquidity or the liquid staking module introduces this thing called a validator bond factor, which forces validators to self-stake some amount if they want to participate in liquid staking. So currently in Cosmos, if you want to accept delegations, you don't have to put any of your own stake at risk. You can have no skin in the game. And there are like off-chain reasons why maybe this isn't totally true. Like, validators, if they attack a network, there might be legal repercussions. It might be hard to off-ramp funds. But it is a fact today that most validators in Cosmos don't have any skin in the game on chain. And this thing called the validator bond will force validators to put skin in the game if they want to take part in liquid staking. And it's proportional. So if they want more stake delegated to them from liquid staking providers, they'll have to put more skin in the game.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, Aidan. We honestly haven't gone that much into this topic of bonding and unbonding in this season. To be honest, Myles and I are maybe a little bit guilty of focusing a bit too much on Lido, but they're just kind of the dominant liquid staking provider over on Ethereum. And for the original whitelisted set, they do not require their node operators to post any sort of bond or collateral. I think going forward in the future for other modules in the staking router, they are going to. It's a fascinating concept that you're getting at here because the principal agent problem has also been a big sort of theme that we've discussed throughout the course of this season. And one of the things that I want to highlight in just hearing you describe, what you're describing is sort of de-risking major black swan events. So I'm sort of reminded actually of the recent merge and Lido's the ability to initiate withdrawals as kind of a de-risking event for liquid staking over in Ethereum. And I'm wondering if the liquid staking module could ultimately be something relatively similar. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but I want to get into this idea of principal agent problem mitigation. Then I actually want to ask you about NFTs because fungibility is another big topic of this season. And I find the NFT approach extremely interesting, actually.
I think it is definitely a de-risking event. There are these two very explicit risks that are being mitigated. So there's the governance risk, the risk that a liquid staking protocol decides to halt a chain. And then there's this validator corruption risk. And the validator corruption risk, quite honestly, is a little bit subjective. Like I said, no one has really done research into how much skin validators should have in the game in order to mitigate the principal agent problem. We thought through some sort of basic scenarios and we proposed some numbers, but I think that there needs to be a lot more research done in this area. That said, there are still open questions. So two other risks that are not being addressed in the liquid staking module, and I think maybe liquid staking module v2 or some future iteration of this will try to address these. One is vote power concentration risk. So this is the idea that liquid staking protocols just decide to delegate to the top 5 validators because maybe that's what users want. And the second is this idea of cascading liquidation unbondings. This is one that Dave from Osmosis has talked about. The idea here is that if you have a liquid staking token and it's used as collateral throughout the ecosystem, if you start to have cascading liquidations, the token might depeg. And when liquid staking tokens depeg, arbitrageurs will come in and they'll unbond them with the liquid staking protocol in order to get the underlying value of that token. So if you can buy like one ST atom at a 50% discount on the open market, you can go back to Stride and redeem it and then get a full atom. So there's like a 50-cent ARB there on a $1 investment. But the challenge or the problem there is you might have large amounts of stake unbond and then network security plummets. So there's like these more exotic risks that haven't totally been addressed yet. But to your point, I think like the very basic risks, liquid staking protocols taking over the chain, and like the principal agent problem just not being addressed at all, which is the current state of affairs. I think these very basic risks, this is like maybe the 80-20 on liquid staking risks, and these are being addressed. So I think I do see it as a big de-risking event for liquid staking, and I hope that many more stakers will liquid stake after they see some of these risks start to be addressed.
Maybe one question actually from me, in this scenario that you need the self-stake from the validator, is this something that Stride validators will have to provide in the scenario, or is Stride actually providing that for the validator? So it has to come from the same address as the validator itself?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It doesn't have, so I think what you're getting at is, validators need to have skin in the game, but liquid staking protocols could also just cover that skin for the validators, and then maybe the liquid staking protocol and the validator strike some kind of agreement. Technically, anyone can cover this skin in the game. Anyone can put up the bonds, but this was mostly just for the ease of the validators. So we've heard from validators that using the key that they use to sign transactions for other random things like doing a self bond, for some of them it's operationally challenging. So technically anyone can put up this stake, but the hope is that it does come from validators and not liquid staking protocols.
Right. And then this certain self bond has like a higher sort of slashing probability, or is like a first tranche, or how do I actually need to imagine? Yeah.
That's another great question. In the first version, it doesn't have a higher slashing rate, but I think it's a very broad design space, and being the first tranche of tokens that are slashed, I think is probably a better design. It's just not built into the first version.
Right, cool. Yeah, they're very interesting actually, also for me. I haven't followed it that closely. I think, what's interesting is that, maybe just to comment, because I guess we had these self-bond ratios already in, especially like Tezos, I think basically like the first proof of stake protocol, which is very renowned to have like a 10% like bonding requirement for the validators. I think there, what was interesting to observe is that validators would like enter into agreements like off-chain with other Tezos holders, like loans, to kind of source that self-bond. And I think that introduces basically, in some ways, it sort of decreases the chances for like smaller operators to even get in this business, and it's sort of like a little bit of a centralization driver almost, because only, like a large enough entity kind of maybe knows like large Tezos holders or can kind of create these agreements. So I think there are also like sort of downsides in these restrictions in terms of like how they impact decentralization, which are sometimes maybe overlooked. But just a comment.
Yeah, it's super interesting, because I've always thought of the self bond as like maybe a higher level of decentralization or risk mitigation that has come at the cost of scaling, right? For something like Rocket Pool. And now, but at the same time, higher self bond, is super important when you're actually trying to make these validators have skin in the game. And you see this on Ethereum as well, where the slashing penalties are often a teeny fraction of whatever profit the validator or the proposer has made off of some malicious activity, right? So each of these decisions comes very interesting trade-offs, and maybe those trade-offs are a little bit different between ecosystems based off of choices at the protocol design level, like delegated proof of stake versus totally permissionless, and all those pieces. So I think it's really interesting. I'm learning a lot as well. And maybe just to get back to kind of the user flow. So Aidan, let's say I've been holding off, right, for the liquid staking module to finally liquid stake in Cosmos because I'm very wary of all these risks. And so I finally, it's implemented onto the hub. I use some sort of interface, I'm guessing, to interact with the LSM and basically shift my native stake to a liquid stake. It uses some sort of logic potentially to redistribute my delegation, or maybe I don't have to. And now I get an NFT, right, that represents my stake and the validator that it's delegated to. So where does Stride come in after that? And or Quicksilver or another LST protocol? And how do you basically take these NFTs and wrap them in a way that makes them fungible again?
So one minor point, I think there are some very ideological thinkers, and for those particular thinkers or stakers, I think the main driver of them deciding to liquid stake might be this technical de-risking event. But for most people, I think the reason that they would be pushed over the edge to liquid stake rather than natively stake is it just reduces the friction by like an order of magnitude. They don't have to unstake, lose all this yield, remember to come back 3 weeks later. They can just go and like try a little, they can try liquid staking a small amount and experiment with it. So the way that the user flow works is if you are a staker on the Cosmos Hub, say you're staked to Chorus One, you can use the liquid staking module to turn any amount of your stake. It doesn't have to be the entire amount. Say you have 100 stake tokens. You can turn one of those staked tokens to Chorus One into an NFT. That NFT says the reward address that earns yield is your address, say Myles, and the validator that the token is staked to is Chorus One. The reason that it matters that the validator is associated with the NFT is different validators have different slashing risk. So for example, if you're holding one of these NFTs and it's staked to Chorus One, and I'm holding an NFT and it's staked to Imperator, even if it represents the same amount of underlying atom, if my stake is slashed, suddenly my NFT is worth less than yours. So this is sort of step one of the flow. You just turn your 1 unit of stake into 1 unit of NFT liquid stake. Then you IBC transfer it to a liquid staking protocol. Currently, none of the liquid staking protocols are built on top of the Cosmos Hub. They're all their own chains. So you could IBC transfer it to Stride or Quicksilver or Persistence, any of these Cosmos LSPs. And then you deposit the NFT into the liquid staking protocol. The liquid staking protocol has to have logic that understands how to handle these NFTs. One really challenging thing is the validator could have been slashed. So there's this like sort of asynchronous logic where the liquid staking protocol has to query the Cosmos Hub and check like, hey, is this NFT actually worth 1 atom, or was this validator slashed and now it's only worth 0.9? So there's a little bit of complexity that happens under the hood there, but that's the high level flow. And then you just receive an ST atom in return, just as if you had staked 1 native atom with the protocol, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. Your user journey is done. So you get your NFT, you bring it over, you liquid stake it, you're out, and that's the user flow.
Aidan, I have a question for you about this idea of NFTs and the fungibility argument that you're getting at here. I think is a really critical one, and it's an idea that Myles and I have poked at a little bit when in some of our more detailed discussions about the staking router in Lido. And one of the questions I think they're wrestling with is, how do we eventually want to? And my sense is that the folks at Lido are trying to design this in so that delegators can actually pick their specific set of validators. The issue is that kind of breaks fungibility. So there's sort of this technical discussion as well as should we do this kind of discussion about sort of because you're messing with this idea of fungibility. It seems like this NFT solution that you have here sort of addresses that. Am I right in thinking that, or can you just like redouble down and explain why these positions have to be NFTs? And if there's can you just redouble down on where NFTs fit into this whole discussion?
Yeah, totally. I think it's a good question, and there's a lot to unpack there. So one question is why build NFT liquid staking infrastructure into the core protocol rather than some more opinionated, enshrined liquid staking protocol?
Right.
A second one is what are different valid designs of liquid staking protocols? On the second one, like a valid design of a liquid staking protocol is just a basket of these NFTs. So for example, like someone could just build a very simple liquid staking protocol that doesn't do any redelegations under the hood. And if you deposit your Chorus 1 NFT into this protocol, it's never redelegated. So you're determining the stake distribution of the LSP. With Stride, the design actually does redelegate. So if you deposit an NFT of a validator that is not in the set, Stride will redelegate or redistribute that stake to the target weight distribution of the set. So there's sort of like a very rich design space there. But in terms of why this is an NFT and not some fungible token, the first thing I'll say is I think fungible LSTs are absolutely required. So composability is, I think, one of the most important things, one of the most important design principles in DeFi. There's already so much complexity. And if you break composability, I think it just makes running infrastructure and making DeFi work much more challenging. It makes like searchers' jobs harder. It makes other protocols' jobs harder because they have to deal with multiple tokens. It exponentially raises the complexity of protocols. So I would be very, very wary about breaking fungibility, even slightly. Like even breaking LST fungibility into like an institutional product and a base product. I think that is it might be a good idea, but I think there are lots of risks associated with that. So I think fungibility is very important. And then maybe the question is like, well, if fungibility is so important, why are these all NFTs? Like this is the opposite of fungibility. Every validator has their own liquid staking token. And I think the design principle here is rather than enshrining one LST protocol, I think building LST protocols is quite challenging and there's a very broad design space. So rather than like one protocol trying to build their own and enshrining it, by building this infrastructure, it lets free market participants try and build and experiment with different designs. So I think that's why the design decision was made to build liquid staking infrastructure rather than enshrining a single protocol. And the NFTs are downstream of that. It's sort of like an implementation detail, but it's also the reason why fungibility, I think, is less important for the liquid staking module.
Absolutely, guys. I think unfortunately we got to wrap up here soon. I guess Felix or Aidan, sort of any parting words that you want to leave folks with, or just good way to follow you or keep more up to date with your work. I know Felix, up until extremely recently, you were the COO at Chorus 1, where I'm sure you'll be very missed. Maybe if you just want to drop some either concluding words or where to follow you or anything like that.
Yeah, thanks again for having us on. First of all, I'm sort of like exploring how to continue my contribution to space. Might also get back into like some more research and content around like these sort of topics. So if you follow me at Felix LTS on Twitter, you'll you'll be up to date on that. And yeah, really enjoyed the discussion. I do think the liquid staking module, generally speaking, is like a great direction, like this enshrined idea, and sort of not opinionating too much and letting like the aggregation happen on the liquid staking protocol layer is a very desirable like kind of direction. And I hope sort of that Ethereum is also moving in that direction and learning from Cosmos. First of all, we have to push it through in Cosmos, I guess, too, but I'm definitely very excited for that. And yeah, thanks guys for hosting this season on liquid staking and having us on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I'm Aidan0x on Twitter, and would love to chat about more of this stuff if it's interesting.
Well, thanks, guys. It's been really great getting the Cosmos perspective from you here, Aidan as an operator and Felix as the Godfather of liquid staking. We're gonna make that a nickname for you, Felix. Guys, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on and chatting with me and Myles, and I'll have to do it again, sometime soon. All right, partner. That was a great one. A lot of fun with Aidan and Felix there.
It was really fun because I think we got to dig into really like the origin story of LSTs with Felix, and then dig into what
you mean the Godfather?
Be, the Godfather, right? So sorry. Our like definitely not self-dubbed Godfather. But
I'm trying to do him a favor, right? He can't ask
exactly.
To call him the Godfather. I'm trying to will this into existence.
Exactly. I think it's totally fair and deserved. And then we got a preview of what is I would say like the cutting edge of LST infrastructure development in the LSM, and potentially a preview of what this could look like if it was mapped over to Ethereum and Lido, because it does touch on a lot of the big questions that we've been talking about this season, as it relates to delegator stake distribution, and how you deal with fungibility, and then just really how opinionated the governance of the LST protocol should be. And so, yeah, happy to start wherever you want, but lots to dig into.
Yeah, let's dig into this idea of liquid staking protocols as a force for decentralization. And this kind of comes down to, I feel like we're going to sound like broken records here, but this tension in between things being permissionless versus the outcome that we want to see. So I broadly see this playing out. So like let's go back to Lido and the staking router and everything that we've been talking about so far this season. So in order for Lido to mitigate, again, the logic train is it's going to be a winner take all market structure. In order to mitigate these calls for self-limiting that Lido has already faced, the road that they're going down is to make the governance of Lido as decentralized, essentially as Ethereum itself. And that's what the staking router is eventually going to do, right? It's kind of this combination of the staking router and dual governance. So instead of just having this permissioned set of node operators, you've expanded it to many, many different modules, DVT, community, etc. Eventually, you can envision a world with thousands of specific modules. So that's one approach. The risk that you take with that approach is that what users ultimately end up wanting is not what is in the best long-term interest of Ethereum, aka having an extremely geographically dispersed and all of those different criteria that comes into having a decentralized validator set. So the risk that you're running of essentially decentralizing governance and then leaving it up to the users is the users could make a poor decision, right?
Yeah.
Right. I would actually say that's pretty likely that ends up happening. So the other solution is what Aidan was describing, which is having the liquid staking protocols be a stakeholder that has an opinion about what the validator set should look like. And the opinion being a decentralized validator set is better.
Yeah, right.
And that's an interesting tension. I mean, that I feel like really got pulled out in this episode.
Yeah. And I think it's, again, a little bit different. The conversation is a little bit different from Cosmos to Ethereum because of this idea that delegated proof of stake is built into the system in Cosmos, right? And so users today already have their ability to pick a validator. And from that, we can see just empirically that leads to a very top heavy set, right? People aren't charitable with their delegations, right? Because they think some grassroots validator is doing a particularly good job in governance or something like that. They might care about that, but they don't care about that as much as safety and yield essentially. And so I think, Yeah, it's very interesting. They're kind of threading the needle over in Cosmos between, finding a much safer and, almost regulated way to mint NFTs, but still, on the other side, to make them useful, you have to give them to a protocol like Stride. And Stride will take an opinion on, what a good validator set looks like. And if, you give them an NFT that represents your stake that's been delegated to a validator who is, already above its quota of stake, they will redistribute your stake to a different one that's lower in the set. But if you give them an NFT that is, representative of a delegation from, let's say like the lowest validator in the set that is not part of Stride's, curated set today, they will also redelegate to someone in their own set. And I think it's super interesting because, I guess to your point, where Lido could go is similar, basically a delegated proof of stake model, where you let the users decide exactly where to delegate, within a module or a particular validator even. But that might not be in the best interest of Lido's, growth, and not in the best interest of Ethereum, the protocol. In the same way that Stride believes, it's actually in their best interest to take an active opinion and redistribute some of the stake here. And I think we'll see a lot of iterations and experiments where it's kind of, trying to do either full on one side or full on the other. And again, I think it's why you should pay attention to Cosmos as a little bit of a preview of what could be coming on the Ethereum side.
And I want to continue to draw this connection. So in the Shriram episode, we talked about this different approach to what a validator should look like as being a defining difference in terms of how blockchain architectures end up panning out. So the defining difference between Ethereum and Cosmos being, in Ethereum land, we want our validators to be, our proposers to be dumb and commoditized. In Cosmos land, we want, what can your validator do for you? And I want to connect this to, we alluded to the John Charbonneau post that went live before, we didn't really have time to look at it before this recording, but I'm gonna share this particular quote, and this comes from Dankrad. And John Sharp was riffing off a quote from Sunny that proof of stake was a mistake. And there's a very interesting choice that he chose to, or a quote that he chose to include here. We should establish a social norm here that building on Ethereum, like building smart contract protocols on top, we should almost never touch that. I mean, it'd be a very, very rare situation. But messing with the staking layer is a different matter. For example, if lots of validators start censoring, we do want the ability to intervene. So I think it would be a good signal to send. Yes, we might be opinionated on what you do with the staking layer, and that might include messing with your protocol and destroying it. Like that very phrase, right, is a very Cosmosian sort of phrase to include there. And I see a lot of arguments sort of starting to shift back around towards the Cosmos side of things, of expanding the role of the validator, of having the protocol actually having opinions on what something like what the validator set for a liquid staking protocol should ultimately look like. And if we do accept liquid staking protocols not as this sort of neutral layer and platform, but instead as a permanent stakeholder with an opinion, then the governance side of these protocols becomes extremely important. That's where you have something like Steth dual governance in the form of Lido. But it's just very interesting.
Yeah, no, I think the other theme that you see being kind of more embraced on the Ethereum side is this leaning into the powers of governance. I think this is a big theme here, where if you have, if you are aligned at the governance level, you can make more opinionated decisions that are, result in a better outcome, or at least a more healthy protocol than if you were to basically let users decide where the stake goes in a delegated proof of stake way, or just make it, more like Ethereum L1's proof of stake, where it's completely permissionless to join. You don't really know who these actors are. And we're starting to see a lot of these ideas kind of translate back, in terms of, what your validators could be doing to be more opinionated, as well as leaning into governance as a force of decentralization. Whereas, up until I would say like this year, governance at the, smart contract level has always been viewed as this existential threat, right, to Ethereum, the base layer for protocols that are super close to the metal like Lido.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And actually, that's what John Charbonneau's post is entirely getting into here, right? We're talking about how governance is ultimately going to work and the role of governance on rollups. And I feel like we've talked about this quite a bit, but I think if you want a mental model for how things like governance and staking are going to play out in rollup land on Ethereum, the best thing that you can do is look at Cosmos and frankly what people were talking about in Cosmos 6 to 12 months ago, because it's going to be an extremely good roadmap for what you're going to look at. And this diagram, if you're following along via video, is John Charb is comparing different solutions. So delegated proof of stake without liquid staking tokens, liquid staking tokens, liquid staking tokens plus dual governance and proof of governance, and sort of all of the different merits, things like capital efficiency, being permissionless, real-time censorship, resistance and web protection, etc. So these things all exist on a spectrum. And one of my favorite things about Cosmos in general is that one of the benefits of frankly not having as much stake or being as large is that they can be more bold in what they experiment with. This 20% limit is just such a great example of that, right? Where in Ethereum, because there's so much more capital locked up there and the stakes are so much higher, there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had. First, do we even agree with this high idea of a limit? And if so, what should that limit be? And we're going to need months of research. In Cosmos, like, yeah, we probably should have one. 20% sounds good. Cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, it's because also like the way that just governance works on both sides, right? Like it's a pretty straightforward process in Cosmos. You have tokens and you vote with tokens and you can change that 20%, right? Whereas on Ethereum, it's much harder to say like, okay, we're just going to start with 20% and then we're going to have to come to social consensus, all over again if we want to actually change this thing. And so, any decision you make there because of the way that governance works is just much more permanent in nature, or at least, that's the implication. So yeah, I think, and just to unpack Sonny's tweet there, I think his point is, okay, you start with proof of stake, the natural market forces obviously make LSTs very, very, attractive in traditional proof of stake. Okay, everybody stakes with LSTs. Now you basically have a pseudo like proof of authority sort of system, right? Because if the majority of the stake is staked with LSTs and the LST governance is in charge of the distribution of that, you've basically, sacrificed like that ability to express an opinion from the protocol layer. And then, but connecting that might not be so bad, right? In some cases, if basically the liquid staking protocol is as aligned as possible with the base layer chain, and you add in some sort of protection like dual governance. But I think the point is, why don't we from the very beginning start with governance, electing like the validator set, right? And that's where you could, in its most extreme form, kind of replace proof of stake with a form of proof of authority that is more controlled through governance. And yeah, I think that it's interesting that people are finally starting to poke at like these, almost well-held assumptions that this was the best way to do something. And now we're just kind of, dealing with the consequences of that choice. But the trade-offs were always, led that to be the best choice in the first place. Starting to poke at that a little bit, especially at the roll-up level, right? And say like a Cosmos chain.
Yeah. Well, I'm slightly stealing this idea from Sam Hart, so I want to give him credit here. But I do think there's, especially in the early stages of a protocol, you can probably scale governance and the decentralization of that governance with the size and maturity of the protocol, which I think, to be fair, is what you're seeing in rollup land. I mean, I don't think you could look at any rollups really today and make a particularly strong case that they're decentralized. I think we're all probably okay with that because there's a roadmap towards decentralization, and all you have to do is talk to these rollup teams, and you will realize very fast that they really do care about that, and it's not lip service or anything. So Yeah, I think there are pros and cons to all of these different things, and even these buckets here that we're looking at are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And you could probably mix and match different parts of these things as well. I want to make sure that we get to the idea of fungibility, because we talked about that right at the end, but I feel like it's a critical point of discussion for this season. And Aidan had a very strong perspective there, which is you cannot break fungibility. Even though there's this concept of NFTs, which inherently acknowledge that not all positions are fungible, the fungibility of the stake token itself, we do not ever want to throw that into question. And that is, I think, an open discussion over in Lido land with the staking router of allowing delegators to connect with certain validator sets. And unless I'm just fundamentally misunderstanding something there.
I just think it like undermines the value prop of liquid staking so much that the trade-off is never worth it. You know, the whole reason you would want to use a liquid staking token over, replicating some pseudo version of that in CeFi is that you have this, great DeFi ecosystem where you can go put these assets to work. And if you break fungibility, then all of that goes away, right? So I think that that's too big of a risk. But the real question is, how can you basically go from an NFT that represents your stake and your choice of delegation, wrap it without actually, I guess, commingling funds or commingling positions, socializing losses of slashing and socializing rewards. You want to keep all of those things, basically NFT specific, but then spit out a fungible liquid staking token on the other side. And this, you could see in the long term, like outcome for Lido or Stride, this might be a way to just fully pull, governance out of this delegation, stake distribution, like decision-making process. And I think Aidan's point is that's actually not a great thing. In that if you just pull that out of governance or pull that out of the protocol and give users your choice, like we already know what's going to happen. We see it on delegated proof of stake networks already. And like empirically, you're going to get a very top heavy set. And so that's going to be a very interesting strategic choice, because it's like, first of all, technically, can we pull this off? Like, is this a feasible, can we have some sort of architecture that makes this work where the NFTs can get wrapped and spit something out? But then longer term, should we, sure, that would allow us to capture institutional users. That's really the segment where we're kind of talking about, or not explicitly, but implicitly talking about, right? Those are the people that care about where their stake is delegated to the most. But, that could be at odds with what, the Ethereum Foundation would consider like a healthy distribution of stake, right? And so the choice is really, if an LST protocol is going to more or less, manage the majority of stake for the network, should that be a proof of authority system, or should that be a delegated proof of stake system? And I think what Aidan and what Lido would argue both is that, we can do a better job than users. And as long as, we stay fully aligned with like the underlying protocol, we can distribute this stake and create a healthier network than it would if we just pulled that out of governance completely. But then, of course, you lose that institutional segment.
And you increase the principal agent problem as well.
Yeah.
Right. That's where
this removes the principal agent problem. But you could see, it's a very clever way to, kind of grow if you're a Lido, and really kind of the counter argument to all these like EF arguments, about self-limiting is, hey, sorry, we're just giving giving that choice to the users. And this is what the users are choosing. They're choosing to stake with the largest validators. And, before you were saying, hey, governance is this huge risk. Well, we've like pulled all of governance's, abilities to be opinionated out. And now you're upset because, you end up with a very top heavy set. So
right.
I could totally see that happening.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, tough tooties, like this is what the users want. But I don't think that we're going to, I could totally see it going the other way too.
The one point that I would just poke at in terms of fungibility is all of these arguments are correct in terms of purely technically what connotes fungibility, but weirdly, it's a social choice as well. And let me give you two examples, which is one, this is one we've already talked about, but bond ETFs. Bond ETFs are a liquid instrument that should not, there's a bunch of non-fungible positions, bonds, that get grouped up into this one sort of index that gets traded, and everyone sort of knows that the liquidity of the bond ETF doesn't necessarily make sense based on what is actually in there. But I think the collective financial world has said, yeah, it's good enough. And we're actually just okay with this.
I agree. I think that's the exact model that this would look like, right? Because each of those, individual, I would say, like bond agreements are, NFTs, right? It is
correct.
They are an agreement between two entities that is unique versus, the same version of that, which is a different agreement between, maybe one entity, but a different, lender, right? But the risk profile of all of them are roughly in line with each other. And so you can package it up in a wrapper, right? So that's what would be the equivalent of like wrapping all these NFTs and having like one fungible asset on the outside that represents a share of them. That's what we're talking about, I think. But where it gets really hard is like, what if one of those bonds defaults, right? And then you have to socialize that loss across users or holders of the bond, or do you not, or can you direct that that loss directly at somebody who's holding the underlying asset? So yeah, I think there's some parallels there that are interesting to kind of tease out.
All right, Myles, we got to wrap it here, but I want to give listeners a little bit of a preview in terms of what we're going to do next episode. So this entire season, we have been going off of a very similar set of design principles in terms of what frankly makes a good primitive, right? Which is, flattening out and decentralizing your governance in the form of liquid staking tokens, and eliminating principal agent problems, and not doing anything that resembles vertical integration. And next week, we're going to get the counterpoint, because you and I are going to be talking to Sam Kazemian of Frax. And Sam has taken a very different approach in terms of how to conquer this market, which I would love. It's always great to get the counterpoint and hear what Sam's doing, because he's got a very interesting way that he's organized Frax. So we're going to be hearing from him next week and get the counterpoint for a lot of the things that we've been saying this whole season.
That'll be great. Yeah, because I think we could see more of those models too. So excited to get the contrarian's view.
Agreed. All right, partner. Wrap it there. This is a good one.